Welcome to the Rural Social Worker Closing the Gaps Despite the Distance podcast. I am your host, Andrea Charles, and this is the space where we will delve into the heart of rural landscapes and explore the essential role of social workers in bridging the gaps in rural social work. Join me as we navigate the unique challenges, celebrate the triumphs, and uncover the stories that shape the fabric of rural life. Together, let's embark on a journey to understand the transformative impact of social workers in the forgotten communities of our nation. A quick note, while our discussions provide valuable insight, please remember that this podcast is not a substitute for official supervision or guidance in your professional practice. Hello, everyone. Andrea here, and thank you for joining me on episode 2 of our podcast, Exploring Dual Relationships in Rural Communities. Today, I want to talk to you about both dual relationships and how to navigate those when you live in a rural community. I want to talk a little bit about what they are and what defining those looks like, and then a little bit about what the NASW Code of Ethics states. So the NASW refers to dual relationships as occurring when two social workers relate to clients in more than one relationship, whether it be professional, social, or business. Dual relationships can occur before you see them, while you're seeing them, or after the professional relationship has been terminated. So the NASW Code of Ethics states that social workers should not engage in dual or multiple relationships with clients or former clients in which there is a risk of exploitation or potential harm to the client. In instances when dual or multiple relationships are unavoidable, social workers should take steps to protect clients and are responsible for setting clear, appropriate, and culturally sensitive boundaries. The NASW recommends that social workers operating in rural areas should possess a comprehensive understanding of ethical obligations. This is imperative not solely due to the inevitability of dual or multiple relationships, but also because the community that you work in may necessitate coming up with new and innovative ways to manage such relationships that's a suitable approach for social work practice. So I want to read a little excerpt from Leon Ginsberg's book, Social Work in Rural Communities. Love this book, has so much good information if you want to just deep dive into rural communities and social work. So I feel like he really defines what it's like living in a rural community with a dual relationship and how those two interact with each other. He states that a social worker meets a client on the street in a small town where she works and lives. She is unsure whether she should approach or avoid the client. A social worker needs his car fixed in a small town where there's only one mechanic, and the mechanic happens to be his client. A social worker discovers a new client is a neighbor. A client belongs to a book club that includes a former client. All of these situations, social workers face decisions about how to navigate these dual relationships. So I want to add, from my personal experience, I have gone to church and run into people, changed churches, ran into people. I have seen people on boards I serve, at football games, basketball games, community events, galas, fundraisers. You run into people often, and they want to have a conversation. When I first see people, if they're in public, I tell people that, when they come in for the first session, I'm going to ignore you unless you come in and you say hi to me. I will not acknowledge you. However, if you want to acknowledge me, you're welcome to. And so they will come up to me and they will talk to me. They want to talk to me. They want to tell me what they've been up to. They want to update me on their lives. They want to just have a conversation and let me know that they're there to see me and that they're happy to see me. They feel like they're connected to you in a way. And you can do this in a way that maintains good boundaries. You don't have to go sit with them. You can just simply say hello briefly and then move on. So this may take a second to stop and have a conversation with them, yes, but it doesn't have to be a long one. And it may also mean that you have to have a conversation with your family or friends about how to navigate those situations when they come up and they're with you and what they should do, whether they should walk away, whether they should just stand there. My kids, when they were little, I talked to them and they would just automatically assume they were a client, because if they didn't know them, then they must be a client. So they would flat out just say, "Are you a client?" So I would tell people that in session as well, is just so you know, my kids have no filter and they know what I do, and they will call you out if you come up and talk to them. I also throw in, like, my family knows what I do. Odds are, if you come and talk to me, even if they walk away, they will know why you're talking to them. So I always try to make sure that they know that before they come up and have a conversation with me, not after. Making sure you have that conversation and setting clear boundaries, because that often prevents problems, but it also, if it becomes a problem, then you can have another conversation. And if it becomes a problem where they're coming up to you often, you can say, I can't have you come up to me in public and talk to me because of whatever it is. I've also had the conversation with social media specifically, of like, hey, you can't friend me on Facebook, you can't friend me on social media. And even if it's our informed consent, which it is, people still do it. So one thing that I say to them is, I saw your friend request. Unfortunately, I cannot accept it because it is a dual relationship. I've had another person who asked me to get them something when I went on vacation. And the first time it happened, instead of explaining why it's not appropriate, I was in Hawaii and I just got this really cheap container of seashells, and I just put them out on the table, and I said, anybody who wants one can take one. And they were like $5 for like 50. It was really cheap. And so that was what I did the first time. However, I've since then had another client ask me, and I'm like, I've had to explain why it's not appropriate because of therapeutic relationship. Even though I do have a more relational therapy style, I am not your friend. So I've had to explain that. That comes to power dynamics, that sometimes clients can hold the position of power. So research states that the dynamic is shaped by the context and nature of the relationship, and social workers may encounter the client wielding influence within the community, placing the client in the position of power over the provider. So that may mean that you have a doctor that comes in and they want to see you, and maybe you're the only social worker, maybe you're not, but maybe you're the only one that does a certain type of therapy. So, like, for a long time, I was the only person who did EMDR in our town. So I often got referrals that I had to make decisions of whether I was going to see that person or not. When you think about whether the dual relationship impacts care, you have to think about, does it impact your ability to do your job? Can you still see this person if they have more power in the community than you, or the perceived power? There are a lot of systems within rural communities that intersect with each other. So you may be doing your thing, and then, like in Ginsburg's book, he stated that you may run into them as a teacher you may know, or a teacher of your child. You may see them on the street. You may be the person who checks you out at the grocery store. But then they can also be your doctor or a doctor you work with. They may be the only med provider in town. They may be a president of a board you serve on, or an organization you're involved in. They could be anything. It can feel often where you do not have the position of power. However, I have found that when having this conversation with people where I perceive that they have more power than I do, they still perceive that I'm in the position of power. So I believe it's more of a conversation of just calling it out what it is, and see if it's going to impact treatment one way or another. The other thing that you have to think about dual relationships is, for instance, a church or a social group where you see a client is in that group. You then know things about that client that they may not have wanted you to know, or you may see things and experience things or hear things from other people, and then you have to decide, is that going to impact how I treat this person when I see them? Sometimes it does, and so then you have to think, can I treat this person ethically, or do I need to refer them out at this point? There is a lot of thought that needs to go in to deciding whether or not a dual relationship is a problem. It's not black and white. It's not cut or dry. One article that I came across suggested that dual relationships are kind of like a continuum. So they aren't always an issue. They can be an issue, but they're not always. And so there's this continuum of seeing, are they or are they not an issue? It really depends on the interaction, the intimacy of the relationship, the potentially harmful things that could come from it. But again, that's the critical thinking piece of outlining whether or not these differences constitute unethical behavior. So when talking a little bit about the nuances in the role context and how dual relationships differ, I find that I often get contacted by friends or family. I have friends and family that will ask for advice. I'll get referrals from pastors, old principals, personal trainers, walking into stores, or they just wanted advice, or maybe they want to know if I'm taking new people. Maybe they want to know whatever. My mom and I always joke that we pick up a client whenever we're out in public, because you'll be talking to somebody and they're like, oh, I need a therapist, or I know somebody who needs a therapist, or my kid needs a therapist. Or I was in Costco the other day and I was just at the front desk doing something, and somebody asked me if I was taking new people for EMDR, and I was like, yeah. And they're like, oh, can I have your contact information? So I was like, I'll give them to them. I don't know this person. And so I did that. And so I picked up a client in Costco. Also, I've had people I know ask to see me, and they have a really difficult time understanding why I cannot. This is a conversation that I do not take lightly, and I really try to have a gentle conversation so that they don't feel rejected, but also understand that it would not be ethical for me to see them, because that can often go badly. I've had it go badly where they get mad because I can't see them, or they try to guilt trip me into seeing them and not understanding. So I've really tried to make sure I tread that. So it's very common to be out and about and they say, oh, so-and-so needs a counselor. Do you have any openings? And so then they refer. What I run into, and it's common to get referrals from people in the community. This is common in rural communities across the country, whether that's a school, a friend, pastor, or other community member. Just due to the nature of rural communities, people are invested as well. So they can feel like they should be able to ask follow-up questions like, hey, how's that person doing? Did they get in contact with you? They don't want necessarily details. They just want to know. And so you have to it's because they care. So you have to be careful on how you talk to them so that you're maintaining confidentiality, but also not hurting their feelings because they care. That's a person who cares. Often people take it really well. One way I do that is I'm like, okay, I can't talk about it's a confidential nature, but also like if you came to see me, I wouldn't talk about what we discussed or the fact that you were seeing me. If I put it in the context of them, because they're more apt, if I put it in the context of them, they're more apt to accept it and be like, oh, you do that for me. I get it. So that does help. The other thing we run into in this community that I'm in is that we are one of the only places that accept interns. I've had a lot of previous clients return to school and they struggle with finding an internship. Thankfully, online therapy has helped with this because they can have an online internship, because I really hate having that conversation of like, yeah, I can't take you as an intern because I saw you as a client. I have had the case where they saw someone I once employed, but never had any interactions with anyone else in the office, as they were only seen after hours for only about a month. This is a case where I would probably staff it and see what the best decision would be and if it would impact their ability to do the internship. So when I think about interns coming in, I have to really think about, how did I know this person? Were we even friends? Right? So if you have a friend that goes back to school and can you supervise that person ethically? I think it depends. I think it depends on the nature of the relationship. If you're in a position of power when you're their supervisor, is that going to change or damage the relationship you have? And will they take feedback from you if they're a friend? Oftentimes, when you get in that position of power with a friend, it makes it very difficult to have that friendship. A large majority of dual relationship questions, I feel, can be solved by thinking about, how does it impact how you give care? Does it negatively impact them and their relationship with you? Does it make them feel uncomfortable? Or could it have a potential to make them feel uncomfortable? Or you uncomfortable? And are you misusing a position of power? So thinking about those things and thinking about how you navigate those relationships, I think about that often with a lot of different dual relationships, and I will often staff those cases with other clinicians in the area to make sure that I am doing the correct ethical thing and making a good ethical decision when navigating the two relationships. Now, supervision and collaboration can be hard to come by in rural communities because there may not be a lot of people to talk to. You may not have a lot of providers. And if you have a colleague in an urban community, they may not understand and be like, nope, you can't do that. Just a hard and fast rule, which may be true for where they're at. But not understanding the nuances that exist in rural communities, can they accurately give you advice? So that can be a difficult thing, which is one reason why I wanted to do this podcast, because it's often hard to navigate these challenges because you have nobody to talk to. You know, almost every training I've ever gone to, and when I was going to school, they talked about, always staff the cases you're questioning about, always seek supervision, always talk to somebody and collaborate when you're having issues around dual relationships. But again, if there's nobody to talk to, what do you do? There's no set decision-making model that is going to say, this is how you're supposed to do it. Just do A, B, and C, and this will work through it, and you will figure it out. Because most of those decision-making models are based on the urban model. They're not going to give you a realistic depiction of how to manage it in an urban or in a rural community. And it's not realistic to think you can never have a dual relationship or it will never happen. Nobody will ever cross a boundary. And so it's important to keep that in mind when navigating these. However, I did read that if you do not have somebody to talk to, the chances of having an unethical relationship increase significantly because you are not getting opportunities for feedback in those situations. One of the articles I read posed an idea that maybe we should change the question from should you engage in dual relationships to why should you engage in them and how are they useful? That really made me think about them differently and really shed light into the fact that how can we use them for good? How do they become useful instead of a problem? Some other good questions to ask yourself would be how long the previous relationship has lasted and how long will the current one last? Having a clear understanding of what you'll be seeing them for and how to maintain professional ethics while doing so. So one thing I have to think about often is I get a lot of referrals from the NASW tribe where we are very close to proximity-wise. We are about 20 miles from the NASW Native American Reservation, the Ninipu tribe, which I talked about in my land acknowledgement. And I grew up there. My mom taught school out there for 30 years. Our family is very well known out there. And so often we'll get referrals because they trust us, because we are part of that community. So the people who are doing the referrals know us. They know what we do. But often I don't know who the person is that they're referring. However, if I do, one, I always staff it with my staff. We also tell them that I own the business if I know them or I know their family so that they can determine whether that's going to be a problem. And then also we tell them, if I know them, that I cannot see them personally, but they can see someone else in the office and see if they're comfortable doing that. And then I often have, if it's somebody I know, have that staff cased with a different clinician than myself. Often we do that with my clinical coordinator instead of myself to help protect that person. And then that kind of solves that problem of the dual relationship. So when we are in school, we learn how to navigate challenges in education based on urban models. Many social workers complain about how their education did not prepare them for working and living in a rural community, especially cross-culturally. So when a social worker is in a rural community, they may have to rethink their professional privacy and dual relationship approach. So in rural areas, there's a shortage of healthcare professionals in general. There's also a need for enhanced training to address the wide range of ages and groups and issues that you will be working with, which is why they often recommend that social workers in rural communities have a more generalist perspective so they can address those needs. According to research, rural providers who are also community members recognize their responsibilities with both their profession and their neighbors who also, or could be also, their clients. So providers are more successful when they understand the rural community's operations and how to come into those communities and be successful. So when you think or are rethinking your professional privacy, that doesn't mean you're going to invite the client over to your house, or you're going to give them your address, or you're going to give them the names of your children, or have them come to your children's games. But they do know what you drive, most likely. And so, like, one of my clients told me the other day, they're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I kind of whipped around you on the bridge. I was in a hurry." And I didn't even notice them, but they noticed me. And part of that is I'm the most oblivious driver. I don't see my surroundings of who is in the cars around me. I'm more focused just on driving. But my car has little dragonflies on the back, and clients know that. And so they know where I am, and they could drive by my house and be like, "Oh, there it is." It's really hard to have a secret in a rural community and not know what people know. They pay attention. They pay attention to your car. They pay attention to where you're going. And if they see your car outside of the norm of being at the office, they're going to be like, "Oh, I know who that is." So those are the big professional privacy things that may need some rethinking. The other thing, though, to keep in mind is we need to understand that in rural communities, social workers are judged based on how they interact with the community more than on their professional skill set. So people could think we are acting like we are better than them if we're not getting involved in the community. I read in one book, we could be viewed as haughty if we don't get involved in the community. It's particularly hard when you grow up in the community and then you start serving that community because so many people know your business from growing up. So they may be judging you not only on your personal life, but even your childhood behavior, not your professional life, not how good you are at your job, none of that, everything on your personal, which makes it hard because especially hard for those people who do not get involved in rural communities because there's no trust there. They won't go see you. And then isolation happens, leads to burnout, and then that provider may leave the area even though we are in drastic need for providers. So we take on all these roles within the community. One article discussed the idea of role confusion in rural communities, and they defined it as blurring a professional and personal boundary in multiple relationships. So social workers often have many different roles, and navigating those can be tried. So social workers can have many different roles, and navigating them can be challenging. One article I really liked how they referenced it is they talked about wearing different hats. That's such a good analogy to use when explaining that they will see their provider outside the office and what that will look like for both the provider and the client, or the social worker and the client. We have this professional hat and then we have this personal hat, and understanding how that works and how we're going to make them feel comfortable and us comfortable, as well as how that power dynamic is utilized appropriately. So when you think about providers coming into a rural community, they're more accepted, like I said, if they become more involved in the activities in the local community. That automatically puts them outside of their professional practice. That automatically ensures there will be a dual relationship. And most dual relationships, according to research, are socially based. And if they're socially based in rural communities, they are not necessarily posing an ethical issue because you're not going to the movies, you're not becoming best friends with them, you're not inviting them to your house, you're not having them watch your kids, you're not having them do any of those things that would be very inappropriate to do. You're just seeing them in a social setting. And being that relationships are so important in rural communities, the provider may focus more on the relationship and the effects of their actions on that relationship more than it only being an ethical issue. So what that means is that if it's going to damage the relationship to sever the social dual relationship, it should not be severed. However, if you can sever it and it won't pose a problem, then there's no issue. But oftentimes people get their feelings hurt, and then this can isolate you as a provider because you're not willing to be involved in the community. After all, you're taking yourself out of those situations. So you are isolating yourself. Another article I came across said a non-sexual dual relationship aimed at enhancing access to care in terms of availability and quality are considered ethical in rural communities. So when I think about that, I think like the EMDR. When I'm the only person that was offering, I maybe took on some cases that had some dual relationships because it was a service that I only offered in the community. Now there's other people who do it, so I can refer out, and it makes it a lot easier. Oftentimes, though, those cases were very brief. They may have been like an intensive where they were only 1 or 2 days. I was very clear that I did not want any details of the issues, that we were only doing EMDR. And if they needed anything else, I could refer them to somebody for talk therapy. So having very strict boundaries around what that looked like. So in general, in rural healthcare settings, providers struggle with the unique challenges due to their close ties with the community. I like to think of it as an art form that you have to navigate appropriately and how to balance those roles of both healthcare professional and an integral member of the social communities that we serve. And it's important to have conversations with clients about dual relationships and what their interactions are outside of your office, because that is a form of a boundary. What are your expectations of those clients outside your office? And how can you do it in a way that maintains the integrity of your professional practice and the integrity of your position as a community member? The other thing to think about as well is the dual relationship or boundary doesn't exist once a client's, or doesn't just exist once a client is discharged from care. You're in a small community. You're going to run into these people later. It's actually one of the things I love about being in the small community I'm in is oftentimes we discharge people, we don't ever see them again. And so it's really nice to see, oh, they're doing really good. They've made a lot of progress. They have a job. They have a family. You get to see all this stuff. Whereas in urban communities, once they're out of your office, you don't usually see them again. So that is one thing I just love about rural communities is the ability to see the progress and see how successful they have come after they leave therapy. There are a lot of things that I like about rural communities. I read this one article that talked about working and living in a rural community can sometimes feel like a fishbowl. And while that can be true, there are also huge rewards to living in a rural community, especially if you are from that community. There's just something special of watching change happen in the community you grew up in. One thing I enjoy is the service aspect of being in a rural community. I feel that in rural communities, you can oftentimes, if you have the right connections and you're part of the community, you can facilitate change and make changes a little easier than in an urban community. You can serve on boards that really make a difference, and you can really make a difference in people's lives. And you get to see this happen oftentimes firsthand. You get to hear their stories. You get to see them out in the community thriving. The marginalized populations that exist in rural communities often come with higher poverty, higher disabilities, higher mental health, severe and persistent mental health disorders. And then also there's a huge stigma, especially if it's a farming community, but it's a small community, right? So people see you coming in and out of the office. So there's a huge stigma with that. And letting them know that you're in the community so that they know therapy is not a bad thing. Social work isn't a bad thing. Getting help isn't a bad thing. So helping to bridge that gap to see that you're human and that you're somebody they can trust. I believe personally that helps reduce stigma. And that's where dual relationships can be helpful to help you be more successful as a social worker in a rural community. Every rural community is different, though. These are generalities and not necessarily things that can be applied to every community. One thing that I want to touch base on is how dual relationships exist in professional relationships within rural communities. We often know other providers in the community. We see them on the street. We see them also, like one met a manager here in town. At one time, he was seeing myself, he was seeing my kids, he was seeing my husband. So I saw him a lot. When I would go in by myself, oftentimes we'd get off on a tangent, we would check in, do my stuff, and then he would say, oh, I wanted to touch base with so-and-so. And so we would talk about a client that he had that we share, or a patient he had, and that was also my client. And so we would talk about that and talk about what I am seeing, what he is seeing, maybe make a plan of how to move forward. The other thing is, like, if I go with my kids, I might say, I need to talk to you. Could you give me a call? And then we set up a time, the next day or something that he could give me a call and talk. So there's that informal relationships that we have with the other providers in the community. And that happens a lot. That happened when I would go to my primary care doctor years ago, and they would talk to me about, maybe somebody they referred, or I've even had, them call me on the phone. I feel like, yes, it makes it so that you always have to kind of be on some level. But on the other hand, one thing I like about it is rural communities make it easier to collaborate with their primary care providers and with their medication managers if we have them in the rural community, because of the informal relationships that we have with those providers ourselves. So I personally don't mind it. I'm sure there's people who do. The other thing is, like, hiring friends. We talked a little about friends being interns, but what about friends being employees? I am working to grow my group practice. Hiring friends, you have to be careful. You have to make sure it's the right type of relationship, especially if you're the boss, of making sure that they can take feedback from you and you can work together, and what will happen if you disagree. And so being able to have those tough conversations. Typically, if you can have those tough conversations up front, it's fine. And, I've encouraged friends to go back to school to become social workers and become clients. I have one in particular that did that and then ended up coming to work for me. And they have a lot of autonomy when they work for me. For her bachelor program, we made sure she was with someone. She did her internship here, and we made sure she was with somebody else in the office, was her supervisor for that program. And so that took me out of the equation, which was super helpful. And then we have just had real honest conversations about how we handle things. And if we have a problem, we address it right away. And I think that's the big thing of what makes it a success. So, making sure that you're having conversations. I think that's true with employees. I think that's true with clients. I think that's true with everyone, is having those open, honest conversations eliminates so many issues that could potentially happen down the road. And it just calls attention to it so that it's not this big elephant in the room that could potentially cause a problem within that dual relationship. So when you think about dual relationships in social work ethics, you're primarily looking at the relationships and dual relationships with clients. However, in rural communities specifically, you also have dual relationships that are more enmeshed than you do in rural communities. You have more personal relationships with medical providers, more personal relationships with other social workers, and with community members. And so, while it's not just clients, it's everybody. You just have to be careful that you're managing these and making sure you're having a good work-life balance so you're not getting burnout. And that's where those honest conversations come from. I do think that they help me personally prevent burnout, because I'm not holding anything in. I'm not, obsessing about anything. And like I said before, every rural community is different. these are generalities. They're not necessarily things that can be applied to every community. And like I talked about in other episodes, you've got to think of it more like a self-help book. Take what works, leave what doesn't, and then take everything with a grain of salt, because you never know what might be helpful and where you might find things that can change your practice. Having that support system in place, knowing who you're going to talk to, and making sure that you have good go-to people to staff things are all good things that help me be successful. I have people that I may talk to EMDR about clients, and I have other ones I talk to employment stuff. I had some issues with an employee that I hired. Well, I didn't actually end up hiring them. And I remember some stuff came up, and I reached out to a previous employer, somebody I trusted, and asked, what would they do? And I asked some of my friends that I trusted that were in the business as well, or in social work. And so it really depends on like who I go to for what. I have a good support network of, okay, this is somebody I talk about clinical. This is somebody I talk about dual relationships. And I also have where I will talk to multiple people about the same issue and then see, okay, well, what is the consensus? What is everybody saying? And kind of get an idea, because I want to make sure that I'm as ethical as possible. There are a lot of social workers wanting to give opinions, especially on Facebook. And so making sure that there are people you can trust. I always like to call them kind of like my tribe. Or I remember reading Abby Wambach's book, Wolfpack, and kind of thinking of it like, it's your wolf pack. It's the people that support you. It's the people that are behind you. It is those people that want to see you succeed and are going to really be honest with you too. You want people in your corner that are going to be honest and call you out on your stuff, because if you're making a mistake, you need to know you're making a mistake. And so that's where it's helpful to have multiple people on your team that are going to be open and going to be honest with you. And I hope, at least my hope is, that this podcast is also something that is helpful and can help you navigate those difficult challenges and know how to handle those difficult relationships, but also know that you're not alone, that there's other people that are out there, other people that are experiencing it, other people that are going through what you're going through, and that sense of community. That's what I want to give people. I cannot emphasize enough how much having those conversations just very bluntly and out loud and addressing that so that it never becomes an issue is. I cannot express how much that has changed my practice. And like I said in episode 1, there are 2 really good books. So if you did not join me for episode 1, those 2 books that they're kind of my go-to reference for social work in rural communities. And the first one is actually called Social Work in Rural Communities by Leon Ginsberg. And it is an easy read. It is very laid out there, and I feel like it's something I connected with well. The other one is Rural Social Work in the 21st Century, Serving Individuals and Families and Communities in the Countryside, and that one is by Michael Daly. Both of those books are very helpful if you want to learn more about rural communities, and if there's a specific topic that you want to know more about, they can offer that in both of those books. So to end, I want to talk about some basic principles from Ginsberg's book, Social Work in Rural Communities, to help social workers navigate dual relationships in rural communities. So they talked about some key things to think about is 1, normalize them. Expect the dual relationship. It's not a if, it's a when. And one of the suggestions was a question I asked earlier is changing that conversation from should social workers engage in dual relationships to when should they engage in them and how are they useful. So that helps kind of open our minds to normalizing the concept of dual relationships, but also thinking about how can we use them as something useful in our professional practice. They also state that if we put up a wall or maybe avoid dual relationships altogether, we're enacting barriers that kind of a us versus them mentality, and that could be potentially detrimental. The next one is professional preparation. So, addressing dual relationships and boundary issues in professional preparation. That is education. We need to be training people in education to navigate these challenges of dual relationships in rural communities, or just rural communities in general. We're not teaching people when they're in grad school how to navigate these, or in undergrad, how to navigate the intricacies of rural communities. And that is doing such a disservice, because then you get the people out in the job force and they don't know how to navigate these. They end up getting burnt out because they don't know how to navigate them correctly. The next one is supervision. So it talked about proactive supervision can provide guidance for social workers attempting to navigate these dual relationships. However, it does recommend that the supervisor have experience with not only dual relationships, but dual relationships in rural communities. The benefits for that can help so much. One article suggests that assessing the amount of power the social worker has over the client and determining how long the relationship will last, and then having clear conditions for termination, observing ethical standards are good questions for a supervisor to ask. Or if you're just a colleague talking to a friend, helping navigate these rural dual relationships. In environments where there are no supervisors, sometimes we have to get creative. Maybe a Zoom group where you get together with people and talk about it. Maybe finding a supervisor that is in a different rural community. It's not yours, but they can at least relate to it somewhat. And it may be even finding a supervisor that's not in your state. So you're not going to be getting any, like if you're working towards licensure, it wouldn't count for that, but it would count for consultation. Online technology has evolved so much over the last few years that has really increased our ability to connect with others, and especially those in our field. Facebook also has groups, and I do a lot of this too, where you can ask questions. How would they navigate it? What would they do? I always suggest when using those groups 2 things. 1, state you're in a rural community and why the things in urban communities won't work. And 2, take what's said with a grain of salt, because everybody on social media has an opinion. The next one is transparency. So that is having that discussion with the clients. That is where we talked earlier about how your actions could be broadcast to the wider community, and they will judge you based on your personal lives rather than your professional. And the dual relationship could be harmed with the client if they see you acting selfishly out in the community or doing something they don't agree with. Not only that, though, it can affect your ability to get future clients as well, because people aren't going to want to refer to you. So you want to think about what the message is you are putting out there of how you are acting and what you are choosing to do and be part of in the community. The last one was authenticity. So that is just being very upfront and very approachable within the community and within your office. Be open to questions. Be open to other cultures in your community. Do the expectations change with those other cultures? We have to choose our roles carefully so that we can maintain and manage dual relationships in an ethical manner. That is all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed listening and gained some helpful information and tips for working with dual relationships in rural communities. If there are stories or issues that you face in your practice and you would like me to discuss those on this podcast, please send me a message at theruralsocialworker@gmail.com, and I will be happy to take a look. One of the goals of this podcast is storytelling, and I believe that to be impactful, you need context, and that is where stories come in. They give us something to work with and something to build on. I also believe that stories from multiple different rural communities will offer more information and provide more support to rural social workers everywhere. So, with that said, I hope you enjoyed this episode and will subscribe for more. Thank you for joining me for another insightful episode of The Rural Social Worker. If you've enjoyed our exploration into the vital work of social work in rural communities, be sure to subscribe, share, and connect with me on social media. Your support helps me continue my mission of closing the gaps and fostering resilience in the places that often go unnoticed. Remember, this podcast is not a substitute for official supervision in your professional journey. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and keep making a difference in rural communities.